Hello and welcome to another video for the FCC Young Adult class. Today we're going to tackle the question, why does anything exist at all? It's a natural question, and I'm sure many people have wondered it over the eons, and it boils down to the simple thing, why is there something instead of nothing? When you go for a walk outside at night, look up at the stars and you see countless numbers of them, and you think of just how big the galaxy is, let alone the universe, and you think, why is that all out there? You go for a walk in the woods and just see the beauty of nature, and you just wonder, why is there something here, in particular with that one, why is there life here? But why is there something rather than nothing? And given what we know about the universe and the world around us, can we infer that there's a creator? Now, I'd like to say this is where the rubber is about to meet the road. So far in this class, we've done 2 lessons. The first one was just an introduction to the subject, and then we went into the ramifications of atheism, and now we're about to look into an actual argument for the existence of God. And in this argument, we're going to be using, logic. And what we'll do is we'll build the case on these logical arguments. And before we get into that, I would just want to do a quick overview of how logical arguments are constructed and how do you arrive at the conclusions when you've actually made one. So the first is, there's a lot of types of logical arguments, from inductive reasoning to deductive reasoning to abductive reasoning, and there's a lot of them, but today specifically we're going to be looking at deductive arguments. And what that is premises are going to be established, and then based on those we will draw a conclusion. And the point of deductive arguments is, if the premises can be shown to be true, and there's a connection between the premises and the conclusion, then the conclusion must be true. So just to recap, we have to show that none of the premises can be false and that all the rules of logic have been followed. Example 1, Socrates was immortal. Now, we're going to have 2 premises and then the conclusion, which is Socrates is immortal. And it's a very logically valid argument because you can see that the first 2 premises are related and that the conclusion would follow if these premises are true. So in order for a skeptic of this argument, the way that they would win or prove that it's false would be to deny one of the premises, because remember, if one of the premises isn't true, then the conclusion cannot be true. However, if they're unable to deny either of the premises, then they will be forced to accept the conclusion. And so when you're making a logical argument, one of the goals is to make it very difficult to reject the premise. And we're going to use the term raising the cost. And so essentially, once that cost gets so high, the person would have to take such a fringe view that it really works against them. So let's move forward. So the premise number 1, all men are mortal. It would be incredibly difficult to prove that this is false. All scientific, all medical evidence, all historical evidence, everything points to this being true. We have never known a person that has lived forever. If somebody was to form a counter argument against this, they would just look foolish. So I think we can safely agree that premise 1 is securely true. However, remember, they only need to reject one of the premise. So premise number 2 is the only place where you can really attack this argument. And so the premise is that Socrates was a man. And so the way to argue against this was that Socrates was not a man, but a myth or legend. For instance, we could argue a skeptic would argue that his collective works was developed by someone else and simply ascribed to the abstract name Socrates. And so, as you can see, rejecting premise 2 is possible, but the price is very high because a vast majority of professional historians agree that he was indeed a man, And so a rejection of this fact would be very fringe. And for instance, both Plato and Aristotle referred to him by name. It seems as though they were referring to a definite man. So premise 2 is much more likely to be true than false. So, conclusion, because premise 1 and premise 2 are more likely to be true than false, the conclusion is that Socrates was indeed immortal. The price of disagreeing with this conclusion is very high because it would be difficult to reject either of these two premises. We're going to look at another thing called argument maps, and this is something that William Lane Craig uses throughout his book that we're following in order to help justify these maps, and it sort of shows like how a person would think through these arguments. So, for instance, they divide the argument into, or each statement into, a pro and a con. So, for instance, all men are mortal. There's really no con because it can't be argued against. Biological evidence shows that human organisms eventually die. It's only premise 2 that you can even have an argument against, and so Socrates is a man, but the argument against it was that he was just a mythological figure, and as we can see, historical evidence, historian evidence show that Plato and Aristotle refer to Socrates as a real person. So it's very unlikely for that to be true, and because those things are true, Socrates is immortal. Argument number 2, all Toyotas run on gas. Premise number 1, all cars run on gas. Premise number 2, a Toyota is a type of car. Conclusion, therefore, a Toyota runs on gas. My question to you is this a sound logical argument? Remember, does it follow the rules of logic? It does. Premise number 1 and 2 are related to the conclusion, but can we show that any one of those premises are false? And indeed, looking at the argument map, we can. All cars run on gas. Perhaps at one point, but now that there are electric cars, and the argument falls apart just on the first premise. So even though a Toyota is a type of car, the conclusion is false because premise 1 is false. Now, back to the real meat of the matter here. Why is there something rather than nothing? And I'm going to discuss an 18th century philosopher and mathematician named G.W. Leibniz. I believe that's how you pronounce his name correctly. I'm sorry if I'm not. But he was a towering mind of 18th century Europe. He was one of the co-discoverers of calculus, Sir Isaac Newton being the other. That's kind of an interesting historical fact if you wanted to read about it later. Essentially, both these two men discovered calculus at the same time, but independently from each other. And there was a bit of controversy at the time that it happened because they weren't sure which one had copied the other, but historians now agree that they indeed developed them independently. And so differential and integral calculus has been credited to them both. He wondered why anything was here at all. So his 3 premises are everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. And 3, the universe exists. So those are the 3 premises that lead him to his 2 conclusions, which are the universe has an explanation of its existence, and therefore the explanation of the universe's existence is God. So looking at it all at the same time, you can see that they're related. In order to get conclusion 1, which is statement number 4, you use premise 1 and 3. So everything that exists has an explanation of existence, the universe exists, and then therefore the universe has an explanation of existence, which leads together. And now that statement 4 has been proven, or we'll show that, but once statement 4 is proven, it can now be used with statement 2, which is if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. And then that combined with 4, which will give you, therefore, the explanation of the universe's existence is God. So what we need to do in this video and today is show that statements 1, 2, and 3 are indeed true. So the only way to look at this is to break it down. I say get ready for your head to hurt a little because we're really going to have to think about something that is difficult to conceptualize, but I think that with enough thought, you can come to terms with this argument. It's not something that I even think you can come to terms with immediately. When I was reading and preparing this, I spent actually several days thinking about it, and I'm going to try to give you some of the ways I was able to kind of come to grips with this. I also didn't just read the book. I went and looked at a couple of other encyclopedias of philosophy to be able to understand these arguments better. But let's start off easy with premise 3. The universe exists. I don't think there's anybody that would argue that it doesn't, because if they did, then they are absolutely fooling themselves, because we're all here, the earth is here, so the universe, I feel, exists. But let's now get to the real point of the matter. And actually, this is the only other premise that I'm going to discuss in this video, and that's premise 1. I think that if we start going too far into things, this video will get way too long and it'll be just too much to digest. But premise 1, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. Now, does this make logical sense? And it's really important to think of all the ramifications of this and all the angles of this. And when I was thinking about it myself, I found it really important not to jump too far ahead. Like, as you can see on further slides, we start talking about God and those sorts of things. But what this point is saying, and the only thing that it is saying, is that everything that exists has an explanation. So again, it's not talking about God or anything else, just that everything that exists has an explanation. And this is actually a really famous principle in philosophy called the principle of sufficient reason. And going to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, they define it as a philosophical principle stipulating that everything must have a reason, cause, or ground. And they say this simple demand for thoroughgoing intelligibility yields some of the boldest and most challenging theses in the history of philosophy. And to formalize it, you would say for every fact F, there must be a sufficient reason why F is the case. And to further expand on that, for every X, there is a Y such that Y is the sufficient reason for X. Now, it sounds very complicated, but just break it down into things of an everyday situation. For instance, let's say you look at the ground when you go out and you see a rock there, and you think, how did that rock get there? And you're like, well, maybe when the snowplow went by in the wintertime, it kicked up a rock and it landed in my lawn, and then a dog came over and put it in the place where it is right now. And you can even keep following that back. Like, how did the rock get in the pavement? Well, somebody dug it up and blew up a rock to make a bunch of gravel, and that's where that came from. Well, where did that gravel come from? Well, when the glaciers passed over North America 10,000 years ago, it brought a bunch of rock from so on and so forth. So as you can see, you can follow this all the way back, but everything that's there has a reason for being there. But also, let's take something complex. I'm recording this on a phone. Well, how did this phone come to exist? Well, there was a company that had a good idea and they decided to manufacture this, and that's how it was made. So, I mean, you can call this about everything, but I feel as though it's not a stretch to say that this statement is true. We're going to get into some really kind of more complex thought in a minute, but I feel like it makes logical sense to say that it's true. So first off, can you think of any objections to this premise? And obviously, I'm asking the question, so I'm going to go into a few objections, just because these are really good questions that people might ask about it. And objection 1, God must have an explanation of his existence. And at first, this seems to be a really obvious hole in the argument. So if we say that everything that exists has an explanation, this means that God must have an explanation of his existence. Now, this appears to be out of the question, because this would mean that the explanation of God's existence was that he was created by a being greater than himself, which we know is impossible. Nothing is greater than God. So a believer might just say, well, God must exist in inexplicably, he's an exception to this rule. So, does this mean that some things can exist without an explanation? Now remember, we're dealing with logical statements, so there are no exceptions. Because if there were, that means that premise 1 is false. So, the clever atheist would simply counter, if you say that God exists inexplicably, why don't we just stop with the universe and say that it exists inexplicably too? There would be no need for a creator. Premise 1 is not only false, but the argument is over before it begins. Atheist mic drop. Not so fast. There are two types of existence, and Leibniz gets into this. And it's kind of a philosophical, this is not unique to him, it's something that has been talked about for a few hundred years now, is that there are two types. There are things that exist necessarily, and there are things that exist contingently. And to quote Craig, things that exist necessarily exist by necessity of their own nature. It belongs to their very nature to exist. Things that exist contingently can fail to exist, so they need an external cause to explain why they do in fact exist. Now, take a moment, try to wrap your head around that. What does exist necessarily mean? So, saying that something exists by its own nature means that it's literally impossible for them not to exist. So regardless of anybody discovering it or thinking about it or building it, they exist. And an example of this is numbers. Like mathematicians think that numbers, sets, and other mathematical entities exist in this way. And they weren't invented, created, built, they simply are. So think about it. And we're not talking about the word 4 or 3 or whatever. We're talking about the concept of those things. And by their own nature, regardless of whether there was any humans or life or anything, they exist. That concept, that's one of the reasons why I think when scientists send out probes or when SETI sends out signals to the universe, they often encode numbers in them because it's something that is universally understood even if there is no other frame of reference. I encourage you after this video is done to just think about why numbers can exist. And going back to God here, the explanation of God's existence is the necessity of his own nature. If God were to exist, it's impossible for God to have a cause. He's a necessarily existing uncaused being. So in other words, the necessity of his existence is the explanation of his existence. So going back to the numbers, you can't explain how they got there or how they were created because they were, by their very definition, they're just necessary. And so we're going to argue, and remember, we're not arguing that God exists here. We're simply arguing that the concept of a God, and I'm not even saying necessarily the Christian God, we're talking about an omnipotent being, like a non, doesn't have a body, it's just a power here. We're just saying that if this type of God was to exist, the only way that he could exist was by his very nature. And another way to kind of think about it as well is, let's say he's a contingent being. Well, that means he was caused by something. Well, what can cause God? Well, a God that's greater than him, or a being that's greater than him. And you're like, okay, that's cool, so he's a contingent being. Well, wait a second here. Well, what about that other God that created him? Is he necessary or contingent? Well, if you argue that no being can ever be necessary, that must mean that he's contingent. So what created him? Well, a being greater than him. And that just goes to infinity. So you can see, trying to define a God as being something contingent, it doesn't make sense. The explanation of a God's existence is that they are necessary and they're not contingent on anything else. And as I said, premise 1 isn't arguing that God exists. It's simply talking about everything having an explanation, and so it's important to understand the difference between existing necessarily and existing contingently. So I hope that makes sense. Now, let's talk about contingent things for another moment. Does size matter? Let's say you're out on a walk in a forest and you found this weird translucent ball sitting on the forest floor. would you argue that that ball was there necessarily or contingently? And let's say your buddy is like, oh, don't worry about it. It's just there. It has no reason for being, or it has no reason. It was always there. Well, that doesn't make any sense. You would say, yeah, that absolutely there's a reason for this translucent ball being there. And so what if all of a sudden you blew that ball up the size of a car and you walked through the forest? Well, you're still going to wonder how it got there and what caused it. And you just keep increasing the size of it, a building, a planet, a galaxy. So what if that ball was the size of a universe? The size doesn't necessarily change whether it's contingent or not. So regardless of the size of something, an object is still a contingent thing. An atheist might say that premise 1 is true of everything in the universe, but not true of the universe itself. Everything that is in the universe has an explanation, but the universe itself has no explanation. Now, I feel it would be very arbitrary for an atheist to claim that the universe is an exception to the rule. As we did through the earlier thought experiment, simply increasing the size of an object doesn't make it exempt of an explanation. But if you think about it as well, it's very unscientific. There's an entire branch of science, called cosmology, that is working to find the explanation of the universe's existence. And so if you were to say, oh, it just exists, there's no reason about it, then all these people would be spinning their wheels for nothing. So let's continue. Let's say they say it is impossible for the universe to have an explanation. And so they will try to justify that the universe is an exception to premise 1. They said it's impossible for the universe to have an explanation. And a reason why they might say that is because the explanation of the universe would have to have some prior state of affairs where the universe doesn't exist yet. And so that would be nothingness, and nothingness can explain anything. So the universe must just exist inexplicably. So break that down. The only explanation of the universe would be a prior state in which the universe doesn't exist. So that would be nothing whatsoever. And nothingness can't be the explanation of anything. This argument breaks the logic rule begging the question, which is where it's sort of a form of circular reasoning, because in order for the statement to be true, the atheist is making the assumption that the universe is all there is, because remember, the prior state of affairs to the universe was nothingness. And so to support that, they have to assume that atheism is true, which is circular reasoning. So if there was no universe and nothing, the prior state of affairs had nothing, it would mean that there wouldn't be a God in that earlier state of affairs. And so you can kind of see the circular reasoning, but it becomes more clear if a Christian says something like, well, the Bible says that God exists, and the Bible is the infallible word of God, therefore God exists. So as you can see, that would be a really poor example of apologetics, because you're just using circular reasoning to try to explain God. And the same is true for the universe being inexplicable. It requires circular reasoning for that to be true. So at the end of the day, is it more plausibly true than false? Is premise true, or is it more likely to be false? And remember, the only thing that we're agreeing on is that everything exists has an explanation. This goes down to numbers, to universal constants, to the rules of physics, to if there is a God, that he would exist necessarily. And that would be his explanation. And at the end of the day, me personally, I feel as though it is true. I racked my brain for a week to try to come to terms with it. And I didn't just look at the sources in the book that we're covering. I looked at, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Logic, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. There was a few other university classes I looked at where they were looking at Leibniz's argument in particular. I actually say that in On Guard, I feel like they skip over some of the important points a little bit, because premise 1 has a lot of ramifications, and I think that if you don't consider the weight of all of those things, you might get kind of lost in the reasoning. So I encourage anyone who really wants to look at this argument to really break it down and think about it carefully. So I hope that I haven't talked way too long, and you found it interesting. And I appreciate that, there's a lot of things to think about here. I think that it's an excellent exercise to try to logically approach your faith, because if you indeed agree with this argument, it's possible to see that, God is the start of everything. That's what turned nothing into something. So thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and see ya.